Jordan, we are live at T-Mobile Park ahead of a matinee series finale where the Mariners have a chance for their 7th consecutive series win. I don't know how many people were expecting a really hot April for Seattle, particularly with their offense. And leading the charge has been Jorge Polanco. Tell us what's been standing out about Jorge's game to you.
Yeah, what an astonishing start to the season for any player. I mean, if anybody was hitting this well for any reason, I think we would be quite impressed. But just when you consider how Polanco's last year has been, it's simply remarkable. For how injured he was last year and end up being this productive is just an amazing development. Obviously, are we expecting him to slug 700th whole season? No, but he's already provided so much for this offense.
If he's not in this lineup doing what he does, who knows where this team is? But the rotation has been hit a bit, right? Logan's out, Kirby obviously starting the season, and then Bryce Miller had some issues before the start yesterday. But what impressed me most about that is just his ability to kind of grind through, right? Walked 5 and still found a way to push through that. What'd you see out of him?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think, as we've talked about this kind of the evolution of this rotation and the versions of it that we've seen, we just got so used to it. It's like, all right, yeah, they'll just dominate for 6 innings, but it's not always that simple. And I think for Bryce Miller in particular, to kind of find ways to, he's not someone that is necessarily going to overwhelm the opponent. And, the velocity was not all the way there last night, the way you sometimes see with guys like Castillo, guys like Gilbert, of course, when he's healthy, and even Brian Wu, who can really dominate with just that fastball. You've seen Bryce add more and more pitches, and his command has not been as sharp this year for sure. I'm sure he would tell you, he'd be the first person to tell you that, but it just speaks to just how talented he is and how good this pitching apparatus is that allows him to still be able to get a lot of outs.
Speaking of injuries to the starting rotation, we've got some more injuries to position players. Just before you joined us, Jordan, we had an update from GM Justin Hollander that Luke Raley is going to be missing at least 6 weeks with a grade 1 oblique strain, and we already know that Dylan Moore is out. He'll come back, so that's good news. But if you're the Mariners, and you are dealing with, you've already lost now 2 outfielders, you've got a utility guy down for a little while, are you calling JD Martinez? I mean, how might you look to address some of these injuries when you're pretty competitive early this season?
Well, if Jorge Polanco is going to keep DHing like this, then I don't know if you want to mess anything up there. But
True.
It's a fair question. I think how this season has gone is so interesting because, you assumed that the first calls that Seattle was going to be making this, coming with the trade deadline or before that would be to add offense. And because of some of these injuries and the bottom part of the lineup, I can understand that. At the same time, as we've seen, it's not just Polanco. Like, this has been a good offense. Polanco's been a huge part of that, but you could also argue that maybe they should be looking for help on the mound. And so that's not necessarily a position we've seen the team operate in recently. We've seen them, acquire some relievers here or there. As for going out and adding a free agent at this stage, I would be surprised. I have no idea what's going on with JD Martinez. I think that's a fair question. I might argue they just as badly need David Robertson, who's another guy who's out there coming off an awesome season. I have no clue what his status is or if he's been throwing recently or whatnot. So maybe there are some other free agents that are still out there for whatever reason that could help, but I still have to imagine they're going to go the trade route as soon as that becomes apparent to them.
With all the injuries, you're going to rely on some young talent, right? We've seen Logan Evans, Emerson Hancock, Ben Williamson. How do you assess this young talent so far at this point of the season?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, we kind of talked about Williamson recently and just understanding the expectations for a player in his situation. And, maybe we'll start to see, if we do get to see an extended run of someone like Samad Taylor, I don't expect, Rylan Thomas, the guy they just brought up for what his major league debut, I don't expect him to be playing all the time. But I don't know. I mean, again, Williamson has generally made the plays that have come to him. He has shown some flashes defensively. He has put together some quality at-bats, and he's already, for someone with his level of minor league experience, I think you have to be pretty happy with him, and you have to kind of hope that he can continue to do that. And that also is related to your previous question, which is maybe we do start to see a Tyler Locklear up here sooner rather than later. I know he's off to a solid start. I know we say focus on the guys at the top of the prospect list, like a Cole Young or a Harry Ford, but Locklear's someone we've seen at the major league level. Didn't always look great, but that's someone that you still kind of want to find out what you have before you totally write him off. And I feel like we might be heading towards that sooner rather than later.
What have you been seeing from Julio? I know that we joke about checking in with you almost every week about him, but look, when you talk about the player that's under the biggest spotlight, it's not going to be Jorge Polanco who's having a hot April. It's going to be Julio, right? And all those expectations in the contract. So what are you seeing from his ABs?
Yeah, I'm going to botch some of the exact specifics, but I know he had an at-bat, I believe it was over the weekend, that was really encouraging, where it was just a big spot late in the game, and he just jumps on the first pitch and hit it to right field. And one of the issues we've talked about a lot in terms of Julio at-bats where it doesn't look great is he gets himself into bad counts, and you know he's going to be liable to chase, and he's just not giving himself a chance at success. And that was a good example where he was like, listen, I understand the game situation here. I don't need to hit a home run. I just need to hit the ball hard, and they're probably going to throw it in the zone in this specific situation. And, you know, he hit it to right field, and that just, you know, totally broke the game open. So more swings like that. Again, he's still hitting the ball hard. He's still drawing a lot of walks, right? I mean, that's something, too, that I think you have to give him credit for. And while I know the batting average has not necessarily, you know, where a lot of people want it to be, and you could say the same thing about Randy, right? Those guys are generally coming through in a lot of the big spots recently, and when you combine it with what Raley and Polanco have done, you got a pretty good offense. And by the way, J.P. Crawford, who's really turned it on recently, I think that's another huge part of this offense recently.
Hey, Jordan, do you know how much prep goes into the games for the batter, right? Because obviously we have all these data points, baseball savant, whatever we need, and we can kind of watch the ABs and talk through it with them, right? How much prep do they go through when it comes to this? Because they play every single day. How much time do you think they spend on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think different teams approach game planning differently, and I'm sure that the new hitting group led by Edgar Martinez, I'm kind of excited to learn more about the, you know, you hear some of these answers, oh, you guys are scoring more runs, like what's Kevin Seitzer telling you, right? And generally in the shorter settings, you just get the very basic, like, oh, well, this is the approach, stay up the middle, do these things. I'm sure it's more complicated than that. I don't know if they've changed the way that they're preparing in terms of just like, okay, this is how we're going to attack this kind of pitcher. Sometimes you do end up situations with information overload, and you say, okay, here's everything that you need to know about this pitcher, when really it's just like, you need to hunt this right now, and that should be your only focus. And for some hitters, they do want to know everything, and some hitters, they need to know, you need to narrow it as much as possible. And for whatever reason, enough of the messaging has resulted in obviously a lot more offensive consistency, even at home, right? And I think that's maybe the biggest part about it. We've been talking about this since the start of the season, with so many home games early in the season. For them to play this well offensively at home is, I think, what's most encouraging.
The Mariners are a flawed, if sometimes really fun team to be able to watch. And so when they appear on a top 10 power ranking like they have recently from MLB or ESPN, it feels encouraging and it can be kind of exciting, but you also take it with a grain of salt going, not only is it April, but man, this team had some big question marks entering the season. That being said, Jordan, given the context of it being only a month into the season, do you see the Mariners as being in a tier of right now really competitive teams?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're still in the stages of figuring out who, as we just, you know, did on our podcast recently, like who's good in the American League.
Right.
But when you win this many series in a row against some good teams, on the road, at home, you're taking care of business against the teams they generally should. Now, there's only been one sweep kind of mixed in there, so they have been dropping some games along the way. And you can also point out that their two series losses were to two teams that I think at this point a lot of people are fairly convinced by, in San Francisco and Detroit. Yeah. So what does that say about them if they couldn't stack up against them? But it's still really early to kind of be drawing too many conclusions in terms of the comparisons. But like I said, you win that many series in a row, you're probably doing a lot right, and you're kind of proving that you are less, I mean, not just that you're racking up the wins, but in theory, you're a lot less slump-proof than maybe I think a lot of people thought this team would be, certainly on the offensive side.
Are there still any just obvious questions you have about this ball club at this point? Obviously, things change series by series, week by week. But at this point, is there a spot you're still looking at and saying, all right, no matter what happens from here on out, this spot needs to improve?
Yeah. So offensively, I think it's kind of what I said before. I mean, obviously he's had a few big swings, but Rowdy Tellez and Donovan Solano, we know those guys have generally struggled. I think still, though, I'm most interested to see how this rotation continues to evolve. And not that you want to see injuries to guys like Gilbert. And by the way, it seems like encouraging news in terms of George Kirby coming back sooner rather than later. But in terms of Kirby coming back, in terms of Matt Brash coming back, and then in terms of, how many more starts are we going to see from a Logan Evans, from an Emerson Hancock? Because especially for Logan Evans, right? Hancock at this point, do we know exactly what he is? No, but we've gotten a pretty large enough sample as a starter where you're starting to understand what you're expecting from him. Whereas Logan Evans, this is kind of the beauty of young players, but especially young pitchers, where it's an even smaller sample size between starts. You can kind of just start telling yourself anything. All right, well, he could go 6 every night. This is what they do. They churn out these awesome starting pitchers. Obviously, it's way too early to know that. He was facing the Marlins. Let's see how he does against some other opponents. And by the way, maybe he's going back to AAA as soon as George Kirby's ready. But how this rotation and bullpen shakes out with Kirby and Brash coming back I'm I think most curious about, because now you have more room for error because the offense is suddenly pretty good, but it's kind of flipping the way we've normally talked about this team. And let's see what they can make happen on the mound.
Speaking about being really excited for certain things, the Mariners slate upcoming here includes obviously the Rangers and A's, and then they've got the Blue Jays, Yankees, and Padres as we inch into kind of the middle of May and end of May. Is there a team in particular that you're kind of eager to see Seattle stack up against?
Yeah, I think San Diego. So I'm writing about the NL West right now for Yahoo, and the Padres are just a fascinating team. I think, you look at their first 10 or so players on the roster, and it's basically as good as any in baseball, at least when they're healthy. But, you talk about depth, you talk about issues after that, and, you could say this is a very real critique of the Mariners roster right now, but I would say it's arguably even more extreme in some respects with San Diego in terms of the gap in talent and production at the top of the roster at the bottom. They just don't have that depth to call on right now, and so we kind of saw that exposed over the last week with Merrill and Arise and Cronenworth being out. But if when the Padres are healthy and those top 3 starters are cooking, they are really, really tough to beat. So especially at home. So I know they just got swept by Tampa over the weekend. They've been battered, but I would imagine by then in a few weeks, Merrill will be back, or, Arise back, Cronenworth back. If the Mariners can really compete against, certainly the Yankees are another team, right before that to take seriously, but against that Padres team, that should be a really fun matchup.
Is there a equivalent to the Mariners out there? Just a team that you watch play ball and say, man, that's the Mariners right there. Parallel universe. There they go.
Man, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. Again, because of how much they've kind of altered the way that we're thinking about things. I will say that the recipe of what we've seen so far, which is pretty good offense, bullpen before Munoz is going to make things a little bit more interesting than you think, but then you have this elite just closer, right? If you can get it to Munoz with a lead, you're generally going to be in good shape. So that would be what I'm trying to think about is teams that have one good, not one good. Really a reliever
but
at the
an
end
obviously
where it's
great.
Yeah, but again, there's some questions otherwise. But I would say a lot of those other cases are a little bit more extreme, right? The Cubs offense is way better than the Mariners offense, but
yeah,
they don't have an elite bullpen, or their pitching staff in general is just way more up in the air than I think where Seattle is at. So I don't think they're going to be playing quite as wild games as Seattle in that sense. But no, it's kind of a weird, slightly alternate brand of baseball than I think we're used to seeing. But maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe that the really, really close, fun differential style in past years, maybe it'd just be better to, win a few games 14-0.
What's kind of fun about that question too, and Jordan, I was thinking about this as you were responding, is if the season hadn't started yet, you'd probably say a team the Reds have, some pretty good arms, and then questions on offense, or there would probably be teams where you'd go, well, this is what the Mariners were in 2024. What's weird about the Mariners is they've kind of shape-shifted. So it's I'm not quite sure who they truly are, or what to compare them to, because no longer is your starting pitching this very obvious elite check, that you have.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we'll find out in the coming months is just where does it end up balancing out, right? Okay, so maybe you end up getting more trustworthy innings on the mound in a Kirby and a Brash, but Jorge Polanco isn't batting, a billion for the whole season. And so, when the offense
he's not Barry
regresses
Bonds?
to some,
that's
yeah. Well, hey, if he is, they're in good shape. But if when he regresses to being merely pretty good, what does this offense look like? Because obviously at times last year it was a very bad offense, but there's a version with just a regular good Jorge Polanco where this is still a good offense. And if you combine that with a healthier pitching staff, which may or may not be the case this season, right? We don't know when Gilbert's going to come back. We don't know how good Kirby's going to be when he comes back. We don't know what to expect from Brash, but there's things to look forward to where you can maybe wonder about that.
Well, we cannot wait to check out that piece on the NL West with Yahoo Sports. It's a really fun division that we don't have to stress about, so that's pretty cool. Yahoo Sports Jordan Shusterman, kind enough to join us on the Emerald Queen Casino Sportsbook Hotline. Thanks, Jordan. You're the best.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you, guys. See you next week.